Hi there, everybody. Today we're going to talk about intelligence testing a little bit. It comes naturally out of Darwin's work. We're going to find that Francis Galton, Darwin's cousin, is going to become the direct leader into this field. All right. So as we're going through, recall we're going to talk about reaction paper 5. All right, and it's a little bit off to the side here as far as a history course goes, but see, this intelligence testing really took off in the United States, and it has become an integral part of not just psychology, but I mean, well, intelligence testing was part of the origins of the applications of psychology. We're going to find as we move along that during as World War I was arising, psychology needed to prove that it could be useful for something, and so they used it for intelligence testing for the military to determine who would be best for certain jobs and occupations and stuff. So we're going to find this intelligence testing and testing in general becomes one of the major applications of psychology that proves its worth to the rest of the world. So we'll come back to these questions here, but these intelligence tests, what are they? What is intelligence? What are we testing? Does it give us anything? We'll come back when we get towards the end. Okay. First thing is, as I said, Francis Galton was Charles Darwin's cousin, and Francis Galton was kind of a slacker, and then when his cousin publishes this book, he gets inspired, and he's like, okay, I gotta work this out. Okay, he came to some conclusions and decided that intelligence is a matter of sensory acuity. Okay, and this is a direct descendant from some of the earlier philosophers. Remember, they would tell us that. The only way that we can know the world is through a sensation. That is, as the empiricists have been teaching you, before something comes into your mind through your senses, you can never have knowledge. Okay, so this is an old idea. Okay, and so sensory acuity, that is, the better you see or hear, the more knowledge you gain. Okay, so the more intelligent you'd be. And sensory acuity is mainly an inherited thing, so he said, guess what? I think intelligence is an inherited thing. Okay? Now, it's just logical at this point. I mean, it's flawed, don't get me wrong, it's flawed, but it's good logic for 1870s here, 1860s. And so he felt that if intelligence was hereditary, then extreme highs and lows should run in families. And so he ran he sent out surveys. In fact, he was the first person to ever create surveys. By the way, this guy Francis Galton was pretty much the first person to do a whole lot of stuff, including fingerprinting, including weather maps. I mean, this guy did you name it, he did it. But he did the first surveys, and so he sends out these surveys to these English scientists and British scientists, and he gets back answers and stuff, and he comes to these funky conclusions, and he basically says, look, intelligence does run in families because the children of eminent men tend to become eminent themselves. But the key is tend. Okay? He was already discovering, and by the way, he's the first one to discover what correlations were. Hint, hint. There's a tendency for eminent men to have eminent sons. Tendency, but this inherited tendency must be combined with what he called hard work and zeal. So clearly he did acknowledge the role of nurture in his discussion of nature nurture, but he put the heaviest emphasis on nature. He was also impressed with how many of the because he had surveyed these scientists of the Royal Academy or something, and what he was impressed with was that the Scottish scientists gave so much credit to the Scottish school system. They said, the reason that I am at the point I'm at is because my school system was so good. So he saw some more evidence that perhaps nurture matters too. So here's where he goes with it. And again, be careful, because I mean, these are logical things. These are really logical, but they turn pretty freaky pretty quick. So if intelligence is inherited, okay, he thinks it is, here's his evidence, then could the general intelligence of a people be improved by allowing the brightest people to mate and discouraging the mating of people who are less bright? And the answer is yes. They've done it with rats. You can breed smart rats and dumb rats. It's not that hard to do. Okay? So he proposed eugenics. Well, he didn't propose eugenics. He proposed this idea that we should raise the national intelligence. Other people took this to the extreme, and we're going to talk some interesting situations. Eugenics is what rose out of this idea. The use of selective breeding to increase the general intelligence of the population. Not just selective breeding, but selective sterilization, for example. Okay? So the government should pay smart people to have kids. The government should pay to educate those children. And eventually, as I said, this turned into sterilization laws. So it got to the point where, let's say in the 1920s or something, in the United States, if somebody was sent into a mental hospital, the first thing they're going to do is sterilization, and now let's talk about treatment. Okay, so they claimed they were sterilizing these patients because they didn't have the facilities to deal with children, but they were forced sterilization. So I don't know. I mean, it was kind of like a judgment call. You know, if you're in a wacky mental house, then you don't deserve. Okay, and so here, listen to me. I jumped ahead. Here he wrote this book, English Men of Science, Their Nature and Nurture. All right, and here's where I talked about the Scottish and stuff. Okay, and so he started the nature-nurture controversy. Lovely. Hey, I said that. Oh, I skipped it. I got it. Ha! So these are questions that in a regular classroom I would sit down and have a conversation about. In fact, these are the same questions I pull up in a cognitive class. They're just fascinating. It just, we'll come back to these. Well, what is intelligence? Good question. The ability to solve problems? Something like that. Do you judge other people's intelligence? Oh, yes, you do. You're judging them all the time based on how the clothing they wear. All right, you're based on all kinds of things. Are more intelligent people more happy? More intelligent people have more job options, and I'll tell you, having the choice to do things certainly leads to happiness. How important is it in our society to be intelligent? The answer is it's everywhere, okay? In high schools, in college, I mean, every test you take is in some way or another an intelligence test, in some way or another. Are less intelligent people more likely to commit crime? And this becomes a charged question because it doesn't feel right, but the fact is, the fact is that everybody wants a 95-inch flat screen television. People that are high in intelligence are more likely to have a job which pays enough money to buy a 95-inch flat screen television, but everybody wants one. I don't know. And so it is quite an emotional thing. This problem of intelligence, though, is such a hot topic because, as Galton pointed out, he had faulty logic, but as Galton pointed out, intelligence seems to primarily, not completely by any means, but in a large chunk, it seems to be something you're born with. And here in America, we like to think the world is fair. The world is fair. Well, every child can become president or something like that. And it's like, I'm sorry, if intelligence is mainly an inherited characteristic, then any child cannot become president, all right? Many children are born and they already can't be. So it's a very emotional thing because it goes exactly counter to the way we think about fairness in this country. So, in a more practical sense, along came Alfred Binet. He was working for the French government. At this point, they were having a big revolution, industrial revolution in France, and there was a major movement of people from the countryside into the cities. And so the schools, in particular in Paris, the schools were being flooded. I mean, they were just having, they used to have 15 kids per class. Now they have 32, it's just flooded with children. And the problem is so many of these kids from the countryside didn't know, because I mean, if they're coming in from the countryside when they're 14, they have none of the benefit of growing up in Paris. I mean, benefit, whatever that means, right? They don't know culture. They don't know the words that you use in France in the educated society. So they were clueless, okay? And so what was happening was these teachers were saying, the kid's stupid, get him out, okay? Get him out of my classroom. And it was a real subjective judgment call, and Paris said, the city of Paris said, we can't do that. We can't just make these subjective judgments. We need to make sure that these kind of judgments are made very, very objectively, not subjectively. And so they hired Binet to make objective decisions about which children were in fact retarded, which ones were in fact unable to work in a regular classroom. So what Binet basically did was he put together a test where basically, well, what he did was he took, keeping it simple here, he took, let's say, 7-year-old children, a bunch of 7-year-old children, and he tested their abilities. He found out these were normal 7-year-olds. They were clearly not retarded children. And so they were normal 7-year-olds, and he basically used that and found out, what does the average 7-year-old know? What didn't he tested a bunch of 6-year-olds, a bunch of 8-year-olds. What does the average 6-year-old know? What does the average 8-year-old know? And then basically what he did was he had a comparison system. He just said, look, here is a child. This child is actually 9 years old. But when you ask questions of this 9-year-old child, this 9-year-old child has the knowledge of an average 8-year-old. Therefore, this child is 1 year behind. Okay, the child is 9. The child has the knowledge of an average 8-year-old. Okay, and so Binet just left it at that. I mean, there was no IQ score. There was nothing like that. He just had, this child is at grade level. This child is 1 year above grade level. This 1 year above age level. And so he said, look, if a kid is as much as 3 years off, that is, if an 8-year-old knows the same as an average 5-year-old, that kid is at the very edge, but that kid could still benefit by being in a regular classroom with other 8-year-olds, okay? But if you got more than 3 years, I mean, 3 years was the very end. If you got more than 3 years off, forget it. That child will never benefit. I mean, if you take a kid who's 13 and he has the knowledge of an average 7-year-old, and you put him in with a bunch of 13-year-olds, nothing. That kid will not benefit from that experience at all. He'll be clueless, he'll be frustrated, he'll quit. Okay? And so that was his benefit. That was his recommendation to Paris. He said, look, there's this 3-year margin. He heard about the other people that had started to turn this intelligence thing into a score, and he was completely against it. He thought the idea of an IQ score was just horrid, because an IQ score almost implies that you are a number, that you are nothing more than this one little number on a piece of paper. And what happens is, this one number on a piece of paper, if that's all you are worth, that is your worth, teachers are going to write off children even more than they already were. See, because, oh, he's stupid, let him out. He's stupid, why bother trying, or something. So he hated the idea of an IQ score, and Binet clearly was not the guy who made the IQ score. That was Stern. I can't remember. No, it doesn't matter. To be honest, I said all those words. Okay, I said that right. Here. So Spearman, Harry. No, Spearman. No, it wasn't Spearman. It was. Gosh, I can't even remember who turned it into a number, but it doesn't really matter. So anyway, Spearman is perhaps the one that has a more recent view of intelligence. In fact, a very big one, the two-factor theory of intelligence. He basically says, look, intelligence is it is nature-nurture. Okay, he says that when children are born, they're born with some kind of a genetic potential, genetic maximum, something like that. And we're going to call that a general intelligence. And this general intelligence is something that seems to help in everything we do. Okay, it's just a general intellectual ability or something like that. And it shows up everywhere. And so then what happens is the experiences of your lifetime will influence the specific skills that you may have. So different researchers have had different specific factors involved. I mean, some say specific factors of verbal intelligence and mathematical intelligence and spatial smarts, and just many researchers have had different specifics. But the point is that all of these specific things, such as perhaps verbal abilities, mental ability, arithmetic abilities, visual spatial skills, whatever, are all basically controlled by this more general thing, this larger one. So it's two-factor, and encompasses both nature and nurture. It's a pretty impressive, and a lot of literature or a lot of research has definitely supported it. Well, let's move this forward. Goddard was this guy here in the United States. He actually was in charge of the Vinland School for the Feeble-Minded. Lovely. He absolutely had a clear policy at his school. All children will be sterilized the moment. The first thing we're going to do is sterilize them. Second thing we're going to do is house them. He wasn't clearly trying to turn them into productive members of society. So he was invited out to Ellis Island to observe immigrants. So he brought out an IQ test with him to Ellis Island, and people were getting off the boat, and basically, pretty much, boom. As soon as they got off the boat, here's this test. You've been in a boat for 6 weeks, something like that. Oh my God, you're seasick, you're hungry, you're tired, you're just nasty, and this guy's like, here, take this test. Now, you don't even understand what the hell he's got going on. He had some translators with him, but apparently the translators weren't very good. So the people are confused. They don't even know, like, what is this guy asking me? And so Goddard, though, concluded based on his testing that 40 to 50% of the immigrants were what he called morons. Morons is was actually a technical term at that time in history, a technical term that meant retarded. So he basically was concluding that like half the immigrants were retarded. All right. He found that in particular there were certain parts of the world that had higher rates of higher rates of, I guess, morons. It's in quotes, higher rates of morons. And he found Northern Europe, that is to say people from, say, Scandinavia, like Sweden or Norway or something, they were bright, man. Let them all in. These guys are awesome. But those from Southern and Central Europe, in particular things like Italy, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Poland, Germany, these places, they had high rates of moron, or, of low intelligence. And he made some suggestions to the U.S. government, and the government, in fact, took him at his word, and they set up these quotas. They set up quotas for how many people were allowed to come into America from certain countries. And so after Goddard's work, it was like, we'll allow 50 people from Czechoslovakia per year to come to America. But as many from Sweden want to come on over. Sweden, you can come for free, right? And his numbers were all based on this intelligence work, and this led to some real problems as World War II ramped up, because these quotas that were put into place limited. That is to say, if you know anything about the history of World War II, the Jewish population was heavily concentrated in Central and Southern Europe, in particular, again, Italy, Poland, Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and these countries had very low quotas. And so as Germany was starting to ramp up its power, the Third Reich was starting to ramp up its power, these people that wanted to get out, they were like, I want to just get to safety. It's very obvious that some heavy shit's going to come down. And the immigration said, no, I'm sorry, we take 50 people per year from Czechoslovakia. That's it, What is that, Poland? We only take 30 people from Poland per year, okay? So good luck getting on that list. Terman was another person that used some intelligence testing. He, in fact, bought Binet's scale of intelligence. He bought it and converted it and printed it here in America, and it became known as the Stanford Binet. And the Stanford Binet was the model of intelligence testing for a good 50 years before the Wechsler test came along, the WISC and the WACE and the WIPSI and all those other ones. And so, WISC, WACE, yeah, that's right, WISC and WACE. So, clearly Terman felt much the same as Galton did. Intelligence is inherited. But he also said low intelligence is the cause of most criminal and antisocial behavior. Oh my goodness, listen to this. There is nothing about an individual as important as his IQ, except possibly his morals. Oh, wow, Terman. He did an interesting work, though. I keep getting my slides out of place. Doesn't matter. What he did was he found some children that were geniuses. See, everybody before had been studying retardation. He studied the other opposite end, the geniuses. He pulled people whose IQ scores were 135 or higher, and he found them in grade school. and then he tracked them. And of course, he tracked them across, and in fact, it was such an impressive study because he tracked them for over 60 years. He didn't. I mean, his research team did for 60 years. Quite a feat. And what they found was that children that had these IQs of 135, their success in life was just phenomenal. I mean, you couldn't even imagine the successes that they had. They became judges and doctors and lawyers, and it was just, the numbers were just impressive. I mean, the one I remember the most is that in his sample of genius children, it was like 40% of the women, and this is the 1930s, 20s, 30s, 40% of the women not only obtained a college diploma, but obtained an advanced degree. Now, at this point in history, 40% of women getting an advanced, okay, basically at that point in history, 0.1% of women were getting advanced degrees. I mean, it just wasn't happening, yet in his sample, 40% were. So he basically uses this to conclude that, I mean, success in life comes from this thing called intelligence. Yerkes. Come on, I see you over there. There's Yerkes. Okay. Yerkes was actually hired by the Army. I briefly mentioned it a moment ago, a while back. He was hired by the U.S. Army to classify soldiers and determine which ones could would make good officers and things of this nature. There was also some personality work to find out what positions that people should go into. But what Yerkes essentially did was created the first, because he had to do a mass testing, and so he made the very first paper and pencil test of this type, and it becomes the foundation of the paper and pencil testing movement. I mean, come on, and go on the internet and you'll find paper and pencil test. Well, nowadays they're internet based, but same idea. And so what happened was that basically Goddard, Terman, and Yerkes concerned because the Army test revealed that the average white recruit had an intelligence equal to a 13-year-old. They said it was caused by immigration. Woo! Yeah, this is a nature-nurture problem, and this debate is not a dead debate. All right, it's still there. So let's go back quick for a minute, and let's talk about this reaction paper 5. Why do people use intelligence tests? I'll tell you, this is an interesting thing. I actually, just one time, thankfully, I taught a course called Industrial Organizational Psychology. I did not enjoy that course. Oh, Lord. But, very interesting. They said, look, they have all of these tests in industrial organizational psychology to predict job success, right? Because, of course, when you're hiring a new employee, you have to be able to predict whether or not that employee will be successful at the job. And they said, there's very specific things, like if you're hiring somebody for a job that involves a lot of typing, obviously a typing test is a pretty good predictor of success, right? I mean, something like this. But it said no matter what the job is, across the board, the best predictor of success at a job is an IQ test. And I'm talking cashier at a gas station, or it doesn't matter. The best predictor of success at any job is intelligence. Wow, that's crazy. Why do people use intelligence tests? Because it predicts. Because it does a really good job of predicting stuff. Does it tell us who is better? Ooh, boy, I put that word better in quotes, all right? That's a loaded word, isn't it? What do you mean better, buddy? Well, that's clearly your opinion to write about that one. What is your opinion about the use of these intelligence tests? Because they are everywhere. They are all over. We are classifying, we are sorting, we are organizing. We are absolutely doing this stuff. It's called the SAT test in grade school. Hell, the STAR testing, or whatever they're calling it nowadays in the Texas public school system. It's all, it's there from the moment the kid is born. Okay? Hell, you know what the very first intelligence test is? It's called an APGAR test. When a child is born, the first thing they do is an APGAR test. All right? And an APGAR test, by the way, this is not a child development class, but an APGAR test is something like they test for responsiveness. If we poke him, does he flinch? They test for color. It's kind of a physical test, sort of. But people call it a baby IQ test. And it turns out that the score a child receives on an APGAR test does a really good job of predicting intelligence test scores later on in life. I mean, it's kind of creepy how this little APGAR test, which is taken 2 minutes after a kid is born, 2 minutes after the kid is born, and somehow this score on this APGAR test can predict intelligence test scores, and intelligence test scores definitely predict things such as the amount of money you're going to make in your life and the amount of success you're going to have. And so from 2 minutes after birth, we can already predict, in a lot of ways, predict who will and will not be successful, whatever that successful means, okay? So it's really, really something there. So, do intelligence tests reveal something about a person's natural abilities? That's what the APGAR test results would imply. Their environmental opportunities? Very much so. Clearly, children that grow up in rich homes have benefits that children that grow up in poor homes just don't have. Is it a combination of both? Chances are both is probably the most logical answer to this. It's up to you to write about perhaps how much of each of these influences there are. Okay? So as you're going and writing your paper, remember this is a history paper, and it really, think about the stories we just talked about with where people such as Goddard went, all right, and talk about that kind of thing. All right, I will see you the next time.